Good morning, everyone. Okay, so we are going to be starting in just a moment. So everyone for this week needed to have practice test 7 done. So we will discuss, kind of just look through each of the sections and see if you had any quick questions regarding how to solve things or about the strategies, because today is actually our last class for this session. So what we have to kind of focus on are kind of recapping what and reviewing what we've kind of been discussing for the last 8 weeks, really. So really kind of just reviewing the strategies in general, as well as making sure you know what you should be doing on test day. Although I did talk about test day a little bit last week because it came up in discussion in class. If you missed last week, it should have been sent and shared with you through the homework email. If for any reason you did not receive the homework email, do email me and I will make sure that you get it. We had a little bit of an issue, I think, with some of the homework getting sent out with the email. But for this and for some other classes. So do just let me know if you didn't get it. If not, if you did, great. But practice test 7 is due for today. Okay. So in addition to practice test 7, you're reading. I know the syllabus that I gave you basically for in the notes says that chapter 14 is due today, but that was actually due the week before. And I just made a typo in my records. So it's chapters 20 to 21 was the recommended reading for this week. And also, if you're continuing with vocabulary study, please do. Because vocabulary study, just a quick note, reminder really about it, is that it's something that you have to build over time. Just like with writing skills, you have to build those skills over time. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. The same thing, so to speak, with reading skills, but the strategies that I've given you are proven methods to help you kind of overcome the type of reading you need to do for the SAT. We are going to do a little bit more grammar review, just kind of looking through anything, give you a chance really to ask specific questions. Obviously, in the 8 weeks of this course, it's really hard to go through every single grammar possibility that you will see. So my best advice to you is to pick up a textbook, go to your library at school, look for grammar resources, talk to your English teachers, because they will have the best resources for you for writing and for kind of vocabulary, as well as what was it I was even saying? So, but for vocabulary, for reading, for kind of writing skills and editing skills, like you definitely want to, for grammar specifically, you also want to be asking your English teachers for advice regarding resources you can go to that are like free for students, because they'll have probably a list of things or recommended sites that they can share with you, or always go to your library as well, because they can provide you with your librarian can provide you with resources for grammar. And one thing about grammar is that grammar changes more gradually than one would think, but it does gradually change. So it's the common types of errors and things are really what you're going to be focusing on in terms of the writing and language test, in terms of the types of writing errors, editing errors, kind of grammatical capitalization, things like that, that are like punctuation errors, mechanics errors. So basically errors that have to do with you communicating language to another person, and communicating a message. So you again, oh, I apologize if everyone hears my cat who just made her way into my office. So anyway, getting back on track here. So today we're going to do a little bit of review. We're going to be looking at our practice tests. We're going to be kind of just spot checking things for you here and there, because by this time I expect you kind of to be familiar with your strategies, familiar with your approach, knowing how to adapt in a testing setting, because you've done enough practice tests that you've been, you can tell when it's going to be a good test, when it's not, or how to get yourself back on track if you feel the test isn't going your way, because you need to make sure you're not being bogged down by the reading, by the passages, by the questions, not letting yourself get lost or get tricked by the test makers. Okay, so that's kind of one thing that I really do want to kind of pinpoint here for everyone, is that the moment you find yourself in a tricky situation on the test, you want to be thinking, okay, can I solve this quickly? Can I not? If you can, great. If then take the quick time, like the little bit of time, a very little bit of time to solve it. Okay. And if you can't, like if you're like, I have no idea what this question is saying, or I'm drawing a blank, skip it and come back. Like note it on your in your test booklet, and note that you need to come back to it. But you always want to be approaching, just as a general rule for the test, answering the easier questions first and moving to progressively harder questions. And the types of questions that are ultimately going to be easier for you will vary from student to student. However, I honestly think for the majority of you, it's really best if you approach it from a detail oriented, like a minute level, basically, of like a tiny detail, for whether it's a textual detail or type question, or it's a word level detail on the writing and language test, as opposed to like a paragraph or full work level. Okay. It will help you ultimately, because you're going to be you're going to be giving yourself the building blocks you need to be able to answer those harder questions. And if you try to tackle the really big questions first, so like the big picture type questions, or the questions on the math test that are going to require a lot of calculations, or a lot, like multiple steps in solving, it's going to take you longer, and it's going to take you more time, and you're going to lose the opportunity to answer the questions that you could have gotten right immediately, because they either don't involve as much work, or they're easy for you to solve, or they are they're more detail oriented, and so they are, or like a single computation that you have to do, or even just like looking at the data and then making a judgment about it. Those types of questions really are the best questions to start with, rather than, and you want to get all of those type of questions done first before you tackle bigger questions that are more complex, that will take you longer to solve. So solving the easier questions first will not only give you more points on the test, because you'll have been able to solve more questions, but it will also kind of boost your confidence as you're going through the test, which is always a good thing. Okay, especially if you feel like you're just not having a good test day. Every little bit of confidence helps. Okay, so every question that you feel that you can get right, or that you're doing, and working towards to get to the end of the test, which is your goal, is going to help you. Okay, so you want to be able to focus on kind of minute detail questions, or questions that are easier to solve, that take less time. So always focus on less time, because you want to be able to give yourself the extra boost of time at the end to go through those longer, more involved types of questions. I hope that makes sense to everyone at this point. So that kind of being said, let's kind of do a little, actually, let's look a little bit at what 21 and 20 and 21, those tests were. So I didn't give you the link for chapter 21, the sample math questions, but if you have your book, it is in there, and the information is available through the College Board's website, but they haven't necessarily fully organized everything the way that they have it in the book, in terms of the information that they provide. So they kind of, I think, lumped the student produced responses with the multiple choice link. So this is really just kind of looking at these chapters in the math section. We're really just looking at specific examples that you can see, and the different types of questions, like the ones that were multiple choice, and then the ones that require you to actually create a response, and then handwrite it in, as well as fill in the bubble for it. Actually, that's a good reminder for everyone. So remember, on those kind of student produced responses where you do have to handwrite the information in for your answer, you always want to make sure you're also filling in the bubbles, because it has to be scanned. Your answer sheet has to go through like a Scantron type machine, okay, so that they can score it for you. And if you don't fill in the bubble, you don't get credit for it, even if you hand wrote it on there. So you do kind of want to make sure you do that. For everything else, again, just simple reminders in terms of the test, the multiple choice section of the test in general. Always make sure you're fully and completely filling in the bubble on your answer sheet, and that you're keeping track of the answers, of where you are on the answer sheet and where you are in addressing the questions, especially if you're skipping around like you should be doing in terms of attacking the easier questions first. So you need to be mindful of just making sure everything lines up in terms of which question you're answering on your answer sheet and which questions you have to go back to, so that you can get the score that you deserve. Okay. So basically that's it. So if you haven't by this time done any of this rating, as I know everyone has really busy schedules, I highly encourage all of you to explore not only the College Board's website, but to really kind of read through these chapters if you haven't done this reading by now. The reason for that is because, and actually read as much as you can about the SAT exam in general, because in terms of different approaches, because you might find something that works better for you. But you do kind of want to be familiar with how the test makers think, because you need to be able to know how they think in order to outwit them, okay? To be able to outsmart what they're trying to do when they try to trick you, okay? You need to be able to understand kind of the categorization that they go through, and then in the context of knowing the actual types of questions that we've discussed in terms of kind of those specific areas of content that you're focusing on, or the structure or formatting of particular types of questions, so that you can kind of understand really what they're asking. Okay, so even if they technically will fall under like information and ideas or rhetoric or synthesis, as they kind of categorize some of these sections in the reading test, you really want to be familiar with the types of questions you'll see, whether it's a vocabulary and context question, whether it's a specifically diction type questions, or if it's something about kind of data response, or if it's an evidence support type question, which is still a relatively new type of question that will always follow either an inferential question, or a text detail type question. So those you want to remember your clues about how to find certain types of questions and when you should be approaching them. Okay. So everyone who hasn't done this, the reading, please do the reading. I can't kind of say that enough. Also, please look at the extra resources that I've kind of provided for you in here. And if you're not sure how to get to the College Board's website by now, there is a link in here for you. You just have to read and find it. It's right here. You want to really be looking at like one other thing that you really want to be able to do by now is to know what your score goals are. And how and the way that you achieve your score goals is practice, practice, practice. Okay. I know that sounds like kind of ridiculous, but it's unfortunately it's true. I mean, really, you need to, the more you practice and the more you simulate and practice and like rehearse the testing conditions, and kind of focus on specific answering and resolving specific question types and being able to identify those specific question types, the easier this test is going to be for you. Also read extensively. That's just a general rule here as well, because the more you read, the more vocabulary you gain, the easier it is for you to understand vocabulary in a given context, even if it's a word you've never seen before. So you need to be able to kind of read extensively and read very different texts. So read a diverse range of texts. So that means read essays, read newspaper articles, read or like science articles or novels or short stories or poetry or anything really, like a memoir, a biography, all of those different types of things, those different types of texts that you see are going to really help you in the long run, because they'll be building your comprehension skills for different types of texts, because the way that you need to approach different subject areas that are involved with reading. So like, I think you've seen that on the reading passages with the different types. So we have like a the literature passage. We have a social science. We also have two science sections in terms of passages, and a humanities or history based or social studies based topic in a subject in terms of the subject matter of the texts. Okay, so you want to be reading all those different things, and reading other types of texts too. So that means like reading manga if you like manga, or if you know what that is, or like reading articles online, or someone's blog, or like just exposing yourself to language, exposing yourself to reading more text, to gaining more information, to being more informed about current events, about things going on in terms of life in general, or in particular fields of study that interest you, is going to help you. Okay. So always be mindful of your score goals, but remember, practice, practice, practice is going to, like, so practicing as much as you can without exhausting yourself. That's key. Okay. So you shouldn't be like doing a practice test a week, like in terms of doing a mock exam a week, but you should be diligently practicing in terms of preparing yourself adequately for taking it. Or like, you shouldn't be doing more than one practice test. I mean, you can do more than one shouldn't, maybe isn't the best wording here, but you can do more than one practice test a week, so long as it's not affecting your overall performance with with the SAT practice, but also with your other studies, because it's very draining going through like 3 some hours of an exam. And that's also why we like really encourage you to practice at least with one practice test a week at home. And even if you have to work it by section, you at least have some experience now doing a full testing, sitting through a full exam. So you do want to try to complete it as a full practice test every time if you can, but if you can't, it's okay to break it down into sections. Just keep practicing is the key. Okay, keep reviewing the materials, keep kind of looking over things to make sure that you are remembering the strategies, remembering what to do in different situations if you come across a question that you thought you could solve but turns out you can't, and then you're stuck because you're in your thought process of I have to be able to solve this, I know I can solve this. And you might be second guessing yourself, and then you're ultimately kind of wasting your own time in being able to address other questions instead of just saying, okay, can't answer this right now, I'm coming back to it. It's taking longer than I have to spend on this question at this moment, so I'm moving on. Always be trying to get to the questions. Okay. Let's see what other kind of useful things. Just reminders here. A reading test, you're aiming for roughly about 12 minutes per passage, including a paired passage, to read and answer the questions. Ideally, you want to read twice, but most students generally only have time to read once, and reading once is fine. You will always, reading something more than once will always give you more insight in general, but it's not necessarily the most ideal or practical approach for this particular type of test. Okay, so when you're reading at least once, you are really focused on basic understanding of what the main idea, the central concept of basically, or the thesis or analytical or argumentative claim is for the text. So what is the author trying to say? What's their purpose in writing? What is their, what's being expressed? What are you looking at? So being able to kind of keep those questions in your mind as you read through it, but focusing on just getting a general gist of what the author is trying to say, so that you can not get bogged down in the passage, but move on as soon as you can to the questions. Because remember, your goal for every section of this test is always to get to the questions. That as well includes not spending too much time on your annotations, even though you do need to annotate. Okay, every student should be annotating to some extent. Okay, because students who do not annotate miss key details, key kind of clues in the text that will give you the right answer to those questions. Again, I apologize if you can hear my cat. So really, you want to be able to make sure that you can that you understand the basic idea of the text, okay, in terms of your reading, and that you are annotating, and by that I mean underlining keywords and phrases, kind of circling proper nouns and numbers again, because if you don't do that, you're going to make a careless error on the text in most cases. Okay, not every student will necessarily do that. It depends on the type of reader you are, and kind of what kind of memory you have, and different things like that in terms of recalling information immediately when you haven't seen it before. But really, every single student, regardless of whether or not they think they can do it or not, without annotations, should be doing annotations. Okay, so because if you don't, you're going to be making mistakes. It's guaranteed pretty much that you will be making mistakes. So do not make careless errors because you didn't read well enough or you didn't do enough annotation. to get you through and answer the questions. So you do kind of want to look at keywords and concepts. You also want to try to code the passage. So by coding, again, I kind of mean talking about like the abbreviations that I have, the code system that I used for identifying certain question types. Definitely, you should be trying to use that if you can, if you have enough time to. And then you also should be writing keywords and phrases in the margins of like near paragraphs, just like you've kind of seen in my annotated notes for you, okay, for a lot of things, so that you can see you're writing kind of information from that you want to kind of refer back to, or you are like key concepts, especially for really long paragraphs that might seem daunting or confusing. You want to make sure that you're noting different changes in the text, okay? Because if you don't, it's going to be harder for you to go back and find information. It's still possible, but you're going to save yourself time ultimately if you do the annotations, because you can see exactly where on your text, in the text, that you made that note about that concept, and you can find it much more easily if it's circled, if it's underlined, if it's written in the margin, or if you have the central theme and concept written up at the top or at the very bottom of your reading passage. Doing that is going to help you in the long run. So you do want to make sure you're doing that consistently, every single passage, every single time, to some extent. It doesn't have to be the extent of underlining that you see in mine, because I, again, interact with my text much more actively when I'm reading, or when I'm annotating and things like that. So it should resemble what the examples that I've given you from previous classes, so that you can see kind of connections, you can find material much more quickly, and so that it ultimately helps you in the long run in answering the questions and not getting lost in the passage. Okay, just kind of things to think about in terms of the reading test too. You're noting main ideas, you're like looking for topic sentences or concluding sentences, and then you have kind of details that you're looking for too in the text. And you're kind of using these tools to help you locate the information more swiftly in the passage and to answer the questions, because your goal is always to get to the questions. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in general. You all have this document, so I'm not going to go read through it again for you, but these are some of the kind of key concepts that are the general concepts that are kind of focused on here. And then we have a reading test type questions. Again, remember, we've got our big picture questions, which are things like point of view of the author, purpose of the passage, rhetorical strategy of the author. And we have little picture detail type questions, which are the ones that you always want to answer first. And the big picture questions are always the ones you want to answer last, okay? After your little picture or your detail level questions, you want to kind of move on to the inferencing questions. Inferencing questions should never ask you to make too drastic of a leap or a jump in terms of logic, or an inference in terms of connection to a different type of idea, okay? Based on evidence of the passage. Everything will have evidence in the passage to help lead you to the right conclusion, okay? So you just need to find it. Function usage type questions, again, this is one of the most diverse types of questions. So the types of things that they can ask you are vary greatly. Generally speaking, though, they tend to focus on things like figuring out what the purpose or effect of a line or paragraph is in the context of a passage. So as well as kind of what its actual function in a line, or in terms of organizational, like organizational function or rhetorical function, or in terms of argument, or in terms of providing evidence and information. So these are all kinds of things that you want to consider while you're looking at that. You can be a usage question that's really looking at how a given word is being used, or how a given sentence is being used, or things of that nature. So you want to kind of consider that as well. And then function usage type questions also really focus on things like figuring out why the author is using certain phrasing. Okay, so that has more to do with like the function of a given phrase or clause or sentence or paragraph, etc., in within the context of a given passage. Just remember too that a lot of the questions that you see on the reading test are also found on the writing and language test. Okay, so there's a lot of crossover between the two. Although the writing and language test tends to focus on, I mean, these are more questions that relate to ideas or expression of ideas, types of things for the writing and language passage. I mean, the writing and language section, as opposed to kind of a reading and interpretation that you have to be doing and understanding an argument for the reading passage. If you have questions about that still, please let me know. Because again, today is our last class for this particular session of this class. So if you don't ask your questions today, you need to let me know, okay? Because if I don't know that you have questions, I can't answer them for you, okay? So again, we kind of talked about vocabulary and context questions several times already today, so I'm not going to really belabor that. Analogy type questions, these tend to really appear on the paired passage in particular, but you want to be very careful about identifying that whether they're asking you to identify or compare a condition or relationship that's described in the passage, or to kind of make a judgment, like determine if a condition or relationship that is not mentioned in the passage. So sometimes the wording might ask you to find something that does not fit the passage, okay? Or the passages in this case. So essentially, like, again, what you're doing really is looking for underlying similarities between the passage and a hypothetical situation. In a lot of different cases, it could be something that's related to a condition or a relationship, but ultimately you're making a comparison, just like with any analogy. You're really kind of looking at those types of ideas and trying to find a connection between those types of with two different passages, okay, that the authors or the test makers are really wanting you to make. Okay, author technique questions. Again, these are one of the questions you'll see the least on this test in general. So things like tone and mood, or other types of writing techniques, or argumentative techniques. Like the author technique type questions tend to fall into the category of general writing techniques, as opposed to that can be applied to many different types of texts, whereas the rhetorical strategies tends to focus on things when you're building a particular type of argument. So those are some different kind of key differences here, but anything can kind of fall under this. So you just want to think back to your writing classes, to your English classes, to our discussion about these types of topics in terms of preparing yourself for addressing a particular question. Chances are you're really only going to see one on each test, if that. Typically, you'll at least see one. So worst comes to worst, if it's not something you remember, skip it, and you can either skip it entirely or make it as an educated of a guess as possible using process of elimination and kind of other techniques that we've been employing throughout the test. Okay, so evidence support questions, again, follow inferencing or text detail type questions or are very close to them. So in terms of like the traditional ones that you'll see, they typically will immediately follow an evidence support, like a text detail or an inferencing question. So you really want to be on the lookout for those and make sure that, I mean, that's another reason you need to be able to answer the detail questions and then the inferencing questions and then things like evidence support. Because if you try to do them out of order, you're not going to be able to answer things appropriately. So you need to kind of like, there is a rhyme and reason for you making sure that you approach it as detail first, then inference, then evidence support. Okay. Data reasoning type questions. So again, these types of things will generally give you some kind of data that you have to interpret and analyze and assess. Whether it's you requiring you to kind of assess how the infographic supports the author's argument. So basically looking at and analyzing the data itself, or it can require you to make inferences about the author's interpretation of the data. So there are kind of two types here that you will typically see. And ultimately what you're doing is putting this data or this infographic within the context of the overall text. So you need to be able to understand, is this actually supporting the author's claim? Is it not? Why isn't it? Where is there a flaw in the author's logic or in the data set itself and things like that? You want to be able to kind of identify those types of things. Okay, again, I do have links for specific types of things, like for strategies specific to paired passages or kind of other types of things as well. But that's in general what you should be kind of exploring on your own at this point if you haven't done so already. Before you take your test, you want to just kind of keep reviewing these strategies, keep trying to find new ways to do things to be able to get you through the test, to be able to be more efficient with timing and pacing on the exam. Does anyone have any lingering questions about the reading test before we kind of look at the writing and language test again? And I promise we will get to the practice test for practice test 7, so we can look at practice test 7. But we do, like, I do want to make sure we kind of do a little bit of review of each section. So looking at things like the writing test, the math tests, just so that you can remember what it is that you need to be able to get done or what to do for each type of section. Okay, so if no one has any questions, then we'll kind of move on. So the writing test notes and concepts here. So again, remember the timing for the writing test, because it's a shorter test, requires about 8 minutes per passage. And typically the structure of the SATs that you will have the reading test and then the writing and language test and then the 2 math sections. Okay, starting with a non-calculator math section and then the calculator portion at the end. You always want to, again, try to read the passage at least once, twice if you have time, but generally speaking, it's better to get to the questions and come back and do kind of more focused reading than it is for you to have to read through the whole thing twice. So the thing with the writing test is that you should still be doing annotation, but mostly or a lot of your annotation is going to be in identifying the type of question you're dealing with. So it's a little less focused on finding information in the text, so to speak, as it is identifying what it is that the question is asking you to solve for. Okay. So, and figuring out within context. So it's more, I mean, you should still be marking up the passage, at least a little bit, in terms of circling numbers, to make sure that you're appropriately answering or looking at the right section and answering a question, that you're really looking not just in isolation at at the particularly underlined section that you have to replace or assess, but to kind of be able to look at things in a larger context. So whether that's on a sentence level or phrase, and whether it's on a, I mean, because your questions can vary from a word level to a whole passage level, like to like a more global level. Okay, so on the writing and language test, you have to really think about it. It's really far more important to identify the type of question you're dealing with and what it is that you have to analyze and determine from context, rather than to really get lost in each of the passages, because you do need to have a general idea of what each passage is about, but you also need to be able to, in order to answer some of the questions, but you also need to be able to look and analyze the language that's being used and determine what is best for solving the question, okay, or answering the question. Okay, so again, you should be doing things like coding the passage and the questions, circling proper nouns and numbers, including the box numbers provided in the text, those types of things, underlining keywords and phrases or concepts, or identifying them, or just where to find them in a passage. Those types of things would be helpful in this particular type of passage. And remember, kind of the key difference between the reading passages and the writing and language test passages is that the writing and language test passages were specifically created for this test by the test makers. So they have complete control over it. Whereas with the reading passages, those are actually created by professional authors. So those are excerpts or adaptations from, or translations from actual texts. So those are, or from larger works. So those require knowing that they're an excerpt from something, and also knowing that they are, or that they're a translation, or know, like that informs your understanding of the context of the piece. So it is important to know that, and you note that generally in the blurb that they have right before each reading passage. But for the writing and language test, they do, I mean, like it's, you have to understand that what they're giving you is someone's draft, basically, of their writing, and that they are asking you to do a revision of it, okay, to edit it, and to kind of help and make sure that what the person's trying to say is actually on the right track, basically. So it's just like if you did a peer review type thing in class, or if you were analyzing and assessing and revising your own essay, being able to look at things as a reader in terms of being the audience that's receiving the message, as well as being able to look at it as the communicator, or the author who is writing and trying to convey the message, as well as kind of looking at it from an editing and revision standpoint, in terms of how can we make the language better? How can we communicate these ideas more clearly? How do we kind of improve the writing in general here to kind of achieve the intended outcome of the author, and to make the audience, to allow the audience to kind of better understand this author's message. So really kind of, you have, on the one hand, you have the author, like you have the reader, who is basically the audience. And then you kind of have the editor in the middle, who is basically acting as the intermediary between the author, so the intended, the one who the message is intended for, and then you have the author who's basically a communicator, who is trying to communicate a message, who's conveying a message. And then the editor's job is really to help both of them at the same time to be able to understand how the writer can be a better writer and communicator, and how the audience, to kind of anticipate how the audience would perceive things, and whether or not the audience's perception of the author's ideas is the way that the author intended, to achieve the author's purpose. So those types of things. It's kind of like a unique kind of balancing act or relationship that you want to kind of think about here. So just kind of getting here again to the writing test, roughly 8 minutes per passage to answer the questions. And remember that there's such a kind of breadth of different types of questions that you can see, or different kinds of concepts. So anything from data interpretation and analysis to focusing on things like redundancy and repetition, or punctuation type errors, or issues, or looking at your editing skills, or as your skills specifically as a writer in terms of your expression of ideas, like looking at sentence structure or syntax and organization, flow, how you support and provide evidence for your central concept or thesis, looking at the strength of the argument, the techniques used for the argument, and kind of writing strategies in general, as well as kind of looking at just general language conventions for the English language, specifically for American English, and then looking for like your knowledge of grammar, your knowledge of mechanics of language. How can you use and communicate ideas using this grammatical system? Okay, that is the English language. All right. All of these things again, and I mean, there's such a huge list really of the different types of grammar questions that you could see. Like it's just there. These again, it's not an like this is not a complete list. This is really these things show up pretty consistently on the test. So chances are these are the kinds of key ideas you want to be really looking at in terms of your knowledge of grammar concepts. And the fact that there are so many things that they can ask you, or that grammar questions tend to be the majority of the questions you see on, in addition to idea-based questions, kind of tells you that this is a key skill you need to review. So if you're not sure about the kind of things that are on this list that we haven't had a chance to go over necessarily, do go to your library, talk to your English teachers, see if there's a way that you can obtain resources to be able to brush up on these skills. You can also, there are a lot of resources available online, as I said, and I do kind of give you some in this document for you. Some kind of great grammar guides and kind of like how-tos to identify sentence error issues or other kind of common writing struggles. Or concepts that are addressed in this writing and language test. So you want to, as well as just in writing in general. So you want to really explore those in terms of going through all of those. Again, just to kind of recap, some of the strategies that we've talked about are things like SQ3R, which is survey, question, read, recite, review, rip rap, rephrase if possible, and read around and predict, skim reading and scanning. I think that skim reading and scanning are things that you're going to be doing on pretty much every passage. Generally, you're going to be, it depends, but you should also be doing a more in-depth reading, which is the annotation type of approach as well. But when you're going back, you're going to be using skim reading and scanning mostly when you are going back and finding answers. But the main strategy that I've given you in terms of annotation and doing more of a critical read is more what you'll be doing when you read through the passages for the first time. Okay. So these are like some of the more general type of reading strategies here. And again, we've kind of gone through and talked about a lot of the content in terms of the types of passages. So again, you have a passage for the reading test that's contemporary or classic work of world or US literature. You also have founding documents in terms of historical works about by the founding fathers, as an example, or the Great Global Conversation type of concepts in terms of speeches or other works related to the humanities, really. You also have social science, so things like psychology, economics, sociology, other types of other areas as well, science passages. So these are typically things that revolve around or science, biology, chemistry, or physics. There are other areas that would fall into science, but are not necessarily things that they focus on. Just because most students are really focused on learning about earth science or learning about biology, chemistry, and physics. So they do try to give some kind of science topic that's related to something that you may have seen or might have studied in school in terms of content. So, I mean, science is a very broad field, depending, like because you have anything from astronomy and astrophysics to microbiology or organic chemistry, things like that, that are much more specialized types of fields than these kind of general ones. And you have different types of sciences as well. So regardless, just be mindful that you will be seeing this and keep track of which type of passage you want to approach first for the reading section again, which we said a little bit earlier. And again, remember that there's this step-by-step guide in terms of from our notes about how to approach the reading passages. Okay, so that includes like memorizing the instructions and kind of just skimming through them before you start each test, and kind of reading through the introductory information. So the little blurb that I talk about every week for the passages and things like that. So this kind of gives you your step-by-step guide and the order really in which you should approach the questions so that you can this for the big picture questions, just remember it doesn't this one I would actually focus on main idea of a paragraph first. For the subtypes, looking at kind of author's point of view and purpose and rhetorical, you could actually go main idea, rhetorical strategy, point of view, purpose, central concept, uses, claim, is how I would actually really organize those types of questions as subtypes. But so long as you're really focused on answering the big picture questions last, you should be fine regardless of the order that you do them in. So yeah, I mean, these again, this is all in your notes from the class using process of elimination. So again, just to kind of reiterate that if you are doing, where'd it go? Okay, here. So if you are doing, which everyone really should be doing, process of elimination, just remember, do a single slash. Don't cross out everything else, because if you do, you're wasting time, and then you have to erase it completely in order, if you need to go back and kind of check your answers, which everyone should be trying to get to that point that you can check your answers to make sure that you've answered everything to the best of your ability, or to the best of your knowledge. So yeah, and don't spend more than 5 minutes reading any passage again. And that also goes for you want to kind of, I would say maybe 3 to 4 minutes at most in terms of spending time reading the passage on the 4 minutes at the absolute most, but 3 minutes roughly for reading the writing and language test passages for each passage, because you only have 8 minutes to answer the questions and you want most of that time to be spent on the questions. I don't think I really addressed that earlier on in the course, but that is something that you do want to kind of be mindful of. And just remember that you always want to try, if possible, to narrow down your answer choices using process of elimination. So you always want to be able to get to the questions, answer the questions to the best of your ability, and try to make an educated guess. If for some reason it's not possible for you to make an educated guess because you're running out of time, or that you just have no idea for the question, you can either, you can choose a letter of the day basically and make a cold guess. So just kind of say to yourself at the very beginning of the test, before even starting anything, that if I have to make a cold guess today, I'm going with this letter, and then stick with that letter for every single section for the test. Just because if you're consistent with the letter that you're choosing, it's better than saying, I don't know which one I'm going to choose, and just kind of like, it gives you more time ultimately. Okay, so those are types of things that you want to think about and consider. We've really kind of talked about the reading test already, and the writing test. Just looking at the kind of like subject verb agreement is always going to be something that's on the test for the writing and language test. Comma usage to some extent will always be there as well. Looking at like sentence issues, clause issues, those types of things are always going to be there. Punctuation in general will always be there to some extent. You'll have one other thing that we did kind of look at last time included, where is it on here? I'm not really, my apologies. I got up very early this morning. So looking at things like understanding what and a positive phrase is, or understanding something like what's a restrictive clause versus a non-restrictive clause. They're also kind of referred to as non-essential or essential clauses. So those types of things are, the main difference between them is that something that is restrictive or essential is required information for you to fully understand what the meaning is of a particular sentence. Whereas in a non-restrictive, non-essential clause, you will have information that's kind of inserted within the sentence that doesn't alter the actual meaning of the sentence if you take it out. Okay, that's kind of the main difference between these two different types of clauses. And so an example might be if you had a sentence that you are kind of inserting, and then insert kind of like a kind of side comment, so to speak, in between, or clarifying, or descriptive phrase or something in between beginning of your sentence, so your subject and your predicate, and you kind of talk about information that's not necessary for you to understand what the actual sentence is talking about if you take it out. If you're not sure what that means, please let me know, and we can look at an example. Other types of things, again, really looking at antecedents, those pronoun agreement, those types of things. We looked at a bunch of these, not everything, of course, but we really kind of focused on some of the key ideas that you want to really review. And then again, I've given you tons of grammar resources to kind of go back to, in terms of what to focus on, what to not, in terms of like basic grammar, intermediate level grammar, upper intermediate grammar. I've given you advanced grammar kind of guides too. And different levels depending on what you specifically need, which will vary from student to student. But your English teachers, your library, again, online resources such as these are going to be kind of crucial to helping you pinpoint your own misunderstandings with grammar and how to kind of identify different types of grammar questions. Okay, so it's 10 o'clock now. Why don't we take a quick 5-minute break? And then what we can do is take a look at some of these examples. And then we can, in terms of the practice test from this week. And then what we'll do after that is kind of talk about the math tests, look at some examples as well, and I'll give you as much time as I can to ask questions. So if you don't have any questions, think of some, please, because this time is for you, okay? And again, this is our last class for this week, for this particular session. So do let me know if you have questions, okay? So 5 minutes. So we'll reconvene, I guess, at 10:06 at this point. And I will see you soon. Thanks. Okay. So everyone should be back from break. We're going to kind of continue with just a review of the math sections and kind of talk about what you can see on them. Actually, I said that we would actually look at practice test 7 for the writing and language and the reading test. So let's actually do that first, and then we'll kind of talk about the math. So bear with me just one moment. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so on screen, you should see practice test 7. So everyone should have been doing this. I don't know why they're highlighting. Sorry. Okay, my apologies. All right, so I was confused for a second. There we go. So if we're looking at practice test 7, we're going to start with the reading test. On this particular test, this is just the actual exam. So I will we'll take a look at, just to remind you, what your annotation should look like for practice test 7 in a minute or so that we can just kind of remind you of what different types of annotation actually look like. We can go through some of the examples from previous sessions. But I do want you to know that this right here, again, everyone should be memorizing. So the directions, everyone should either have memorized or at least be so familiar with that you just have to skim through this to make sure they didn't make any quick changes on you. And then actually you do want to note here for this particular passage that there's a pretty long little blurb here that they are giving you about this particular work by George Eliot. Okay, so understanding what is kind of being talked about here. So this is obviously the literature passage here that we kind of started with here. And if you're not familiar with George Eliot, it's a very famous author. And it was published in 1861 originally. But this is kind of an excerpt from Silas Mariner. Okay. But really what this kind of passage looks at, I mean, like, it's a pretty decently length, pretty decent in terms of its length, but it's looking at the different characterizations between, and the interaction specifically between Epi and Silas. Okay, so at a time of when when Epi basically came into his life and how that kind of transformed his life. That's ultimately kind of what this is really looking at. So looking at what he was like before her and what he's like with her, to kind of know. So really here we're looking at things like central concepts, themes. So you can even see the first question is dealing with what choice best describes a major theme of the passage. So in this case, we're really kind of looking at a lot of narrative structure type things. Like here we're dealing with the narrator, as opposed to an author, or another speaker here. So we're really kind of working within narrative structure of George Eliot's kind of broader narrative as a whole. So we're kind of looking at different types of questions. So question 4 could fall into the text detail type of question, because it's referring you back to line 7, and it's also asking you to but it's also kind of asking you to make an inference, to make a judgment here about epi, of how the author is portraying epi. So it's also looking at the differences between the narrator and the different characters in this work, as well as to kind of have you focus on characterizing the different characters. So here, that's really what you're doing. So it has a lot to do with determining how epi is in this particular, like what kind of quality we would ascribe to epi in this passages for the time that we see her. We're also looking at, like if we look up here, which statement best describes a technique the narrator uses to represent Silas's character before he adopted epi. So here, technique type question, really, we're looking at, they're at least giving us different examples here that we can kind of choose based on what we know of Silas's character from the passage, what we know of epi's character in the passage, and how they kind of have interacted. So those are kinds of things that they're having us look at in this. Again, question 5 is kind of dealing with looking at textual detail in like information in the text. So according to the narrator, one consequence of Silas adopting epi is that he we'd have to answer this question in order to answer the evidence support question that follows it. So therefore, this is actually more of a text detail or inferential type question than if we were, we can kind of expect it. It is based on text detail, like on information in the text, but we also have to kind of make a judgment about that information and infer based off of what we know, not only of Silas from the narrator, but of the narrator, in terms of what the narrator is talking about, like whether a narrator is reliable or not. Like those types of considerations kind of influence our perception and understanding of the consequences or things that are happening around the events in this story so far, of the little bit that we see. Again, we have a lot of evidence support questions. So question 9 is also evidence support. So following question 8, which is really looking at relationship between epi and Silas and making connections between them. So here it is kind of asking us to look at the text, asking us to kind of determine and make a judgment based off of what we know of epi, what we know of Silas, what we know of the narrator, and of the events that are transpiring, and what we can kind of surmise based on the text. So that kind of means this is more of it is text detail again, but it also kind of involves inferencing information about the text, like gleaning information below literal interpretation of what's happening. So here we have a function usage question. So where we're focusing on, does the second paragraph in lines 30 to 52 serve, what does it serve in the passage as a whole? So we're looking at the purpose basically of a particular section, of a particular paragraph, and how it kind of fits into the broader narrative of the whole. Over here, question 10 is again a good example of a vocabulary and context question because it's literally giving us the clues of used in line 65. The word fine means, I mean, those would be things that I would underline going through here. So it's literally vocabulary and context diction type question where you have to figure out what the author meant, given the context that it's being used, given the time period of when it's being used. So remember, this was originally published in 1861, so the meaning might be slightly different than what we expect it or we would perceive it today. So you need to be able to make those kinds of sort of those minute changes, nuances really that you have between word usage over time. So our understanding of fine might be very different from 1861 of what they would think. So you need to kind of bear that in mind, and you can kind of even see that a little bit because they give you like the answer choices of ornate, delicate, keen, acceptable. So fine, in this case, we could easily kind of, I mean, we would normally think it's more of like, if it's fine, it's acceptable, right? But that's not necessarily how it's being used in this context. So it's going for an older meaning. So in this case, so if we look at line 65, also by the time Epi was 3 years old, she developed a fine capacity for mischief and for devising ingenious ways of being troublesome, which found much exercise, not only for Silas's patience, but for his watchfulness and penetration. So fine capacity for mischief. Does anyone have an idea of what this might be for question 10? Because actually, I mean, if you're really looking at these words, fine can actually mean any of these, but in this specific context, D should really be the answer. So we can expect something that's fine to be like a fine sculpture. So like it's a kind of ornate sculpture, like so something like that. It can also mean I'm fine, which could be acceptable, or those changes are fine, they're acceptable. You could also have a fine bit of lace, which is very kind of intricate and delicate. So all of these words can kind of fit for this word. So what your task is to figure out which is the best word. And if you don't know what keen really means, you should definitely look it up and add it to your vocabulary list. But it is really kind of looking at highly developed, or, I mean, there are many different meanings for it in general, but really kind of having or showing great perception or insight, or highly developed, or eagerness or enthusiasm. So having or showing eagerness or enthusiasm or interested, depending on how it's being used. There are many different kinds of interpretations of that word, but in this case, really what the author is meaning is that they have a keen, like if we actually put that in this context, it would make sense. So also by the time Epi was 3 years old, she developed a keen capacity for mischief. Doesn't quite flow quite as smoothly, but we can understand what's being said. Instead of an ornate, delicate, or acceptable. I think that those would be inappropriate here, in which case the word keen would be the best choice to kind of equate what the meaning is for fine in this case. So it's more of looking at something in context of the passage as a whole, especially when they try to give you something challenging like this, because not in every single vocabulary and context type question will have every possibility be like every answer choice be an actual possibility like this one could be. It's because of the type of word that we're dealing with that this happens to be the case, that these words, these synonyms here, could truly be applied to fine in many different contexts. Okay, so you need to kind of look for nuances in the words and figure out from the context within the text what would make the most sense. So in this case, fine is being used in the sense of that she has a kind of propensity for trouble, that she is has an eagerness or enthusiasm for being in trouble, or that she has developed kind of a sense of being able to get into trouble, like she has a knack for getting into trouble. Those types of things kind of fit this description of how this particular word is being used. So that's one thing that you can kind of look at too. Continuing here, anything else here that is sort of note that might be good to talk about? We've already talked kind of about this. It's a function usage type question. If we look at the next passage, so this one has to do with, it's published by the MIT Technology Review. So therefore, it would most likely fall into our science category, right? So it also contains infographics again. So you want to make sure that you're carefully looking at any infographics. Again, I know we've talked about this, but it's very important because the test makers are going to try to trick you as much as they can. And sometimes that can be in how they present the information to you, and what's being presented. So you really need to pay attention to any information about what's being talked about, and kind of really look and break down the infographic you're looking at. Okay. The same thing here for any of these, and you want to kind of read identifying information. So what's figure 2 about? What is figure 1 about? And kind of understand what's being expressed, and then think about it in terms of the actual its usage and connection to the passage as a whole. Okay, so here we have a main purpose question, so big picture question right off the bat. We would want to tackle this one last, and looking at, again, question 14, we have primary purpose of lines 26 to 28 has to do with function and usage. So it's not a purpose question so much as it's dealing with the actual function of those lines and the purpose behind those lines. So it's not, so it has to do with how they're being used, not so much what and what the author's intention is. So it's not this type of purpose, which has to do with like the purpose in writing, for instance, or the purpose of communicating this message, which is the author's goal. So those types of things. Does anyone have any questions specifically they wanted us to look at from the rest of the reading test? I mean, we've kind of talked a lot about the different types of things that you'll see, how we've gone over in previous classes, how to annotate specific questions, to kind of break them down, to identify that like this should be a data response question here because it's saying according to figure 1. So anything that's referencing the infographics is going to end up being a data response type question. So you want to be able to make those kind of connections, to identify that and know what type of question you're dealing with so that you can figure out how best to answer them. The next one is really, again, another science passage because it's by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So this is definitely science-based. And again, they try to trick you by starting with the purpose of a passage. So you would always want to try to tackle that last, even if it's given to you as a first question, for a particular passage section. And then you're dealing with kind of author usage of certain sections, evidence support, inferential questions, kind of text detail type questions up here. You're dealing with vocabulary and context. So, I mean, main idea of paragraphs, and then dealing with kind of analyzing text detail of like a particular phrase, things like that. And then you have the paired passage in this one was a more humanities-based passage, since that was the only one we hadn't seen. So remember too that just because it starts with with a particular passage category in terms of subject matter doesn't mean you need to answer that section of the passage first. You do need to make sure you're marking carefully on your answer sheet so that you can answer the question for whatever passage section you're looking at, which is also why it's really helpful that they give you the question numbers that are associated with a given passage or passage set. But you do want to kind of make those notes. And here again, we have a really kind of long little blurb. And that's the key information for you in here. It also talks about these are texts from 1840, 1851. So we've had something from like the 1860s, we had something from 1840, 1851. And then in terms of the difficulty of the language that you're going to be seeing. And then here we had something from 2013. And then we had something from 2014. So we had some very like relatively like pretty recent things in terms of the science type of passages. And then we have some very like more challenging type things from the 19th century. So that might be more difficult for you in terms of language. So those might be things that are a little bit more dense or that are harder for you to follow because the way information was communicated was in a slight like somewhat different way than from how we communicate things today. It might be like longer sentences, longer sentence structure, things like that that you want to bear in mind. So you do want to consider that too when you're thinking about, okay, how am I approaching each of these passages too per test? Does that make sense? And then our last passage, of course, is the social science one. So here, I mean, this one is again more of a recent one where we're focused on something from the Smithsonian, and then we're kind of looking at. Well, actually, we're looking more at particles and microscopic. So this is more science-based. So one of the other ones was more. So this one actually would have been more social sciences, or the other one was more social sciences. Economics would fall more under social sciences. So this is definitely a social science for the MIT, even though it was from MIT Tech. I was thinking immediately that it would be more science-based, but it can equally be humanities or social science-based. So you just want to be mindful of that and be aware in identifying the different types of passages you're looking at. Any questions from the reading test from practice test 7 that you really wanted to go over? Okay, so if not, then we're going to kind of look at our, yeah, this is definitely science. So this is definitely looking at like we're dealing with electrons, neutrons, photons, Higgs boson, neutrinos, all of that, tau, that kind of fall into that. So it just depends on what you're talking about. And sometimes there's going to be crossover between different subject areas, but I think they do try to keep them specifically a literature, specifically science, specifically humanities-based type things. All right. So writing and language test. So again, 35 minutes, 44 questions, just like we had, what is it? So for the essay, for the reading test, it's 52 questions and 65 minutes for the SAT. And then for the writing and language test, it's 35 minutes and 44 questions. Okay, so again, roughly 8 minutes versus roughly 12 minutes per the reading test. Okay. So here, again, you really want to memorize these instructions. You want to do some annotation of the text, whether in mostly like identifying proper nouns and numbers, identifying these these places where the questions are kind of directing you in the text with these kind of square numbers. And then identifying and focusing most of your time on identifying what this question is asking you to solve for, based on your knowledge of the text, and looking not only at the underlined portion, but looking at the kind of work, I mean, the broader, at least at minimum on a sentence level, to understand what's going on, but also kind of reading above or below as appropriate per question, and looking and thinking about what this whole passage is about as well, depending on where you are with it. So were there any particular questions that you had from the writing and language test? I mean, because a lot of these things are dealing with understanding logic and reasoning, ideas, dealing with verb forms, dealing with grammar, other grammar concepts in terms of like past tense, present tense, punctuation, conjunction usage, phrasing, different things like that you kind of want to bear in mind, using transition words and phrases, making additions or deletions of text, and why, and making sure that all the ideas kind of fit together. Like here, which should definitely be a punctuation type question, because we see that one example doesn't have a comma in number 13. One example does have a comma. The last example has a semicolon, and then the one that we see here has a dash, which is actually, reading it in context, inappropriate. To perform their jobs successfully in this dynamic environment, workers in many fields. Given the fact that there's a comma here, rather than this also being set off by an M dash, means that this one is incorrect. So therefore, in most likely, I would have to specifically double check, but question C, or like C, should be the right answer here, because you need to have it match in terms of its structure. You could technically offset from social services to manufacturing in another M dash here, but it would need to match in this case. So you could use M dashes that way, but you do want to do that sparingly. And it's most likely more appropriate here to have a comma. So it says, to perform their job successfully in this dynamic environment, workers in many fields, from social services to manufacturing, must continually acquire relevant knowledge and update key skills. So what they're doing here, this prepositional phrase, from social services and then to manufacturing as a prepositional phrase, you are really kind of providing additional information, like clarifying the many fields. If we take it out, it doesn't really alter the meaning of the sentence, because workers in many fields must continually acquire relevant knowledge and update key skills. It's just providing additional information. So it's more of a non-essential or non-restrictive clause than it is a restrictive clause here. So therefore, that's why we can kind of fit in a comma here, which would make more sense. But you always kind of want to look out for those types of things. here again, another type of punctuation question. And especially because you can actually tell that it's focused on um, different like punctuation at end of sentences, or like we're dealing with combining sentences. So therefore you can kind of eliminate some of these as a possibility. If employees find themselves failing or falling behind in the workplace, these critics contend. That doesn't actually make that much sense here. These critics contend, then it is the duty of those employees to identify and even pay, which of course they always like to try to spread things out onto separate pages to make sure that you don't see everything. So always check previous pages or next pages to make sure there's no additional information you need to answer a question. And even pay for appropriate resources to show them how and why they are falling behind and what they should do about it. So here, I mean, if we're kind of looking at that, what question number is this? 16? So for 16, really, you want to kind of think about that you kind of need a comma between the dependent and independent clauses, which creates one sentence. The introductory kind of conditional dependent clause beginning with if cannot stand alone and needs to be separated from the independent clause by a comma. So we kind of look here. If employees find themselves falling behind in the workplace, these critics contend. So that means D is what we need, which is a possibility, but it's really kind of looking at what makes the most sense, because you have an introductory clause here with if employees find themselves falling behind in the workplace. It needs to be attached to that dependent clause needs to be attached to an independent clause. These critics contend, comma, then it is the duty of those employees to identify and even pay for appropriate resources to show them how and why they are falling behind and what they should do about it. So in this case, it doesn't really make sense to have any of these other answer choices. You do need some kind of pause between contend and what comes after, because what comes after is actually a separate clause. Okay. But ending with just contend by itself doesn't make sense in this particular context. So A, B, and D in this case are incorrect because they don't provide an argument for, I'm sorry, that choice A is incorrect because the dependent clause, I was looking at 15 in my mind. Choice A is incorrect because the dependent clause needs to be attached to an independent clause. Okay, so if you look here, contend with a period followed by then doesn't make sense, okay, because it needs to be attached to an independent clause. And these critics contend isn't really a complete thought. Okay, so that's why it's not really contend what. We don't really have additional kind of information. Whereas choice B is incorrect because a semicolon would be correct in this context only if it were connecting two independent clauses, which it's not. And that's because these critics contend isn't really a complete thought or idea. Contend, we need something that they're contending, so to speak. Does that make sense to everyone? We also have choice C, which is incorrect because there is no comma between the dependent and independent clauses. Okay, so this one is dealing with combining kind of a more complex sentence structure using dependent clauses to, you kind of need what follows contend to explain what is being contended. Does that make sense? So that's why we need to kind of use the comma in this case for choice D, because it's providing additional information that is kind of further supporting our kind of main clause, which is the second sentence. I mean, the second portion from then. Okay. All right. So I think that's really kind of it for what we're going to talk about for writing and language and the reading test. I do want us to be able to get to math. If you still have questions, please let me know. But since no one's been asking any, I'm going to kind of think that you are pretty set to go. You understood where you went wrong with this practice test. Everyone should have self-scored. So you should know approximately like how many per section you're getting right and how many you're getting wrong. And you kind of want to keep a tally of, as you go forward with your studies, to kind of make sure that you are reviewing any information that, or any question types that you consistently get wrong, and you're noting any patterns that may occur in the types of questions you get right and wrong, so that you can kind of fix the ones that are easier to fix for the ones you get wrong, in which case those would be things like the ones that you make silly, like little errors with, that could easily be overcome. But if it's a more content level type, a deeper kind of understanding that you're just not getting the content that's being discussed, or you're not understanding the question, that's something that requires more intensive study, and it requires more kind of practice and work with understanding the concepts and things that align with this particular test. Okay. So that's like doing your grammar review, doing things like that. Okay. So now we're gonna switch gears again before we really look at the math test in terms of practice test 7. I do kind of want to look at our notes a bit. So bear with me one moment. So I'm going to share about the math test now. Okay. So the SAT math test, again, everything focuses on real world questions. So that really kind of means, sorry, I'm slightly losing my voice. It's really focused on questions that are applicable in real life. So there are things like figuring out percentages, figuring out like rates of change, or different things like that, that are really looking at like variables and different things too. So you're really going to be focused on problem solving and modeling that you do in college, that you'll end up doing in college level math, science, and social science type courses, as well as in jobs that you hold or in your personal life. So this is things like, you may have like a budgeting question. You might have different types of questions asking you to solve a problem, to figure out how many of something you might need, or what to do to figure out, like in a science problem when you're dealing with variables or things like that, that you need to take into consideration. So some questions will ask you, will be quick to solve in terms of your kind of discussion of, or like it will basically address something that only takes like one action that you have to do to solve the question, like, or like one type of problem solving that you'll have to do to solve a problem. But others will be multi-step. So they will require multiple calculations or procedures to be able to achieve your answer. A single calculation is rarely enough in the real world to get a job done. So that is why most questions will involve some kind of multiple step process that you have to go through to get to your answer. So the test is really trying to prepare you for the kinds of questions and situations you will encounter later on in life, beginning in college, especially, um, and career, really. So you're really going to be looking at things like quick facts. So most math questions are again going to be looking at things like they're going to multiple choice, but some called grid ins, which are the second half of the questions that you do in each section, really kind of ask you to come up with answers rather than selecting the answer. So they're asking you to actually do the calculation without giving you things that you can choose from. Okay. So you have to actually provide a response based on a math problem without really being given as much guidance as you would in having the information there for you in an answer choice. So that it's really testing your problem solving skills and your ability to think on your feet. So the math test, again, it's divided really into two portions. We have the calculator test, which is the fourth section you deal with, and then the non-calculator section, which is the third one you deal with. Some parts of the test include several questions about a single scenario. But the focus really of the math section is on kind of the heart of algebra again, which is focused more on linear equations and systems and understanding and mastering those types of skills, as well as kind of quantitative problem solving and data analysis type questions that really require you to be aware of different methods for problem solving and analyzing data in many different contexts. The third section of types of questions that really influence the math sections are what they call the test makers called passport to advanced math, which features questions that are requiring the manipulation of complex equations. So these are typically harder questions in general than either of the other two. And I kind of feel that these are, these will definitely require multiple steps to solve. They may require understanding more complex concepts in most cases, and that um, they may end up being ones that you have to make an educated guess on, if you can. Otherwise, they may end up being ones that you need to just do a cold guess for or to skip entirely. So that kind of depends on how confident you are with your math skills and where you are with them, and whether or not the algebraic type questions are better for you, or problem solving and data analysis, and what your score goals are. Because ultimately, all of these things work together to create your scores. So you want to do your best to answer the questions that you feel confident answering, and then spending what time you can trying to solve the more complex ones. So most likely the questions that you should be spending the latter half of the test time on are the passport to advanced math type questions. The earlier ones that you should be able to do more quick solving for would be things like heart of algebra and problem solving and data analysis. Again, the College Board has a lot of free resources from the Khan Academy. Embrace also has tutorial videos for each section of the practice test that we've really looked at, that are kind of breaking down how to approach the math section for them, for these. So you do want to explore those if you haven't done so already. Embrace has a YouTube channel that is very helpful for students in terms of being able to provide additional kind of resources and instruction to help you troubleshoot specific types of problems in a way that we don't necessarily have the time to be able to go through for every single thing in a class like this. So it's because math and every section of this test is so individualized to every single student. Um, we don't always have the luxury to be able to spend just like we don't have the luxury to spend on every single grammar concept, even of the ones that are most frequently used. We don't always have the luxury to be able to go through and address every single math concept, but that's what additional resources are. That's why we point you to the videos. That's why we kind of point you in the direction of where you need to go to address these kinds of concepts to help you specifically tailor your studies. So everyone should be doing that, and should be aware of the kinds of questions you typically get wrong on the math tests, whether it's the calculator section or the non-calculator section, so that you can kind of proceed with your studies, and always be improving. So really what the math section really focuses on is your fluency with math. And that just basically means how kind of adept you are at carrying out procedures for different types of math computations, how accurate you are, how flexible and efficient and strategic you are in your approach to the math sections, and whether or not like you are consistently choosing the most complex way to solve something, or if you can find the simplest way to solve a particular question. Because remember, the majority of these questions will have many different ways that you can solve it. And just one method isn't always better than the other, or another. So you want to be able to quickly solve problems, which is the focus of this type of test and purpose. So it asks you to identify and use the most efficient solution possible. Okay. And that is a skill that you can develop as you go through and do and practice with all of these different practice tests, to kind of get more experience with the math, doing certain practice problems, because the way that you might have been taught in school for certain math sections or math questions may be very different from a different, like another approach that might actually be simpler, or that might be not the concept that you were focusing on in that particular math class, because your math teachers know that there are many different ways to solve something. So but in certain sections, when they're going through like your coursework, they would have to focus on particular types of, or particular skills, or particular types of like ways of solving a particular type of question, so that you can learn how to solve it using that method, even if you've already, like if there are many other ways that you can do it. So it's to kind of help give you the skills to work through different kinds of problems, and figure out how to most efficiently get through things and quickly, so that you can, because that's really what you need mostly in the real world, is to be able to quickly problem solve and efficiently and effectively and accurately problem solve. So that means showing your work. That means being able to not skip steps when you're showing your work too, because you need to be able to prove that, yeah, I know how to get this answer, and this is exactly what I did, so that your boss or whoever it is supervising you, or who is like, or other scientists or whoever you're working with, can actually say that, yeah, I can see where you got this, and that makes so much sense. Or no, you did not, like, rather than getting into like a plagiarism or a copyright issue, or like, no, I don't think you know how to solve this, or you made an error here. I can see that because you skipped this step. So you need to actually carefully show all of your work, but you want to find the right way to solve a problem as quickly as you can, to get to the answer. So again, because with this test in particular, your goal is always to get to the questions, to get to the next question, to finish the section, to get to the next section. Does that make sense? Okay. So you might, like, some types of approaches you might encounter could be things like inspecting a problem. So you might not even actually be required to solve something. you might just have to look at the information provided and determine how, determine based off of the knowledge that they give you, of how to best assess something. Sometimes you might not even have to do a computation. You might have to just look at the information that they include in the question and keep in mind all those kind of component parts and kind of piece things together. Um, there's a good example of one. I forget the exact problem number, but there is one in section 4, I want to say, for practice test 8, that kind of shows that it uses variables, but if we don't know what the values of the variables are, like it actually, let me see if I can bring that up, because I think that that's a really good example. And I just did it earlier this week with another class, which is why it's in my mind. But thinking about, actually, let me stop sharing and share again. Nope, wrong one. Okay, so if you kind of look at, I can get into the math. I think it was in, not that one. It's one that looked scary with the formulas, but was actually not. I know it's in here. Sorry. If I can find it, I will show you. But it's a really good example of, where you're given information and you have to kind of solve something that looks really daunting, but is actually very simple. Maybe it was practice test 1. I don't think so. Don't think it was practice test 3. I mean, section 3. Anyway, if I can find it, I will let you know. But there is, I mean, sometimes you really don't even have to actually solve something. You just have to be able to figure out what the question is asking you, and make a judgment based on that. Oh, maybe it was in this section. Maybe. Well, I'm sorry, I can't find it, but it was, a really good example. But anyway, there is one in here where you really just have to, figure out what is being kind of said, from the data that is in the question. But I mean, you can do that like here in terms of, like, you don't necessarily have to solve, for certain questions. You don't have to, like, if you can manage it where you don't actually have to solve and you can still get the right answer, you want to be focused on doing that, because your goal is always to get to the next question, next section. Yeah, it's a shame. That's such a good, it was such a good question. And I just can't think of where it was in the section. Yeah. Mm. No. Can't find it. All right. So anyway, kind of just getting back to what we were talking about, was really focused more on it's going to be driving me crazy now that I can't find it. All right, but that's okay. Anyway, regardless, just believe me that there are examples of certain questions where you don't actually have to solve something. Yeah, that's the end of the section. So just keep in mind that you are really you're focusing on trying to quickly problem solve. So you want to find the most efficient and fastest method to be able to solve something accurately, and to be able to get the right result. You also really want to be looking at like understanding what graphs do and the different types of things like linear equations, how to graph a line, like a straight line, y equals mx plus b, those types of formulae that you need to familiarize yourself with. You also really want to kind of focus on finding using as much of the information from the question as possible to help you solve the question, and eliminating any other distracting information that they might be trying to throw at you. Okay. It's also a test that is really going to be focusing on your understanding of general math concepts, operations, and relations. So order of operations, being able to approach and solve things appropriately, and being able to understand kind of the different properties of linear equations, or particular like properties of multiplication or addition, or different ways of writing an equivalent expression or inequality, that or equation that you need to be able to do, because a lot of the types of problems that you'll deal with require you to put an equation that's expressed in one form into an equivalent form, so that you can then really present it in a way that meets the needs for the given question that you have to answer. And sometimes it's as easy as just putting it in a different form, and by knowing the different properties of multiplication, addition, etc., they're really going to help you understand how those basic kind of properties are applied of operations are applied to, and just knowing what like an integer is, what an imaginary number is, all of those types of things, what a radical is, or like what a fraction actually represents as a ratio, as a decimal, and all those different things, as a real number and things like that, that you want to be able to know what those terms mean, and how they affect math, and your understanding of it, so that you can then use those tools to help you solve questions. Okay. So in particular contexts. So you also need to know things like for the calculator section, how to graph a parabola. You really need to be very familiar with your graphing calculator. So for like instance, I'm getting mine, which is probably older than most of yours. But it's still the basic kind of principle. like depending on what type of calculator you have, knowing how to kind of solve things, how to plug them in, being familiar with all the different buttons on your graphing calculator. If you're using a graphing calculator, which everyone should be, ideally for this test, in order to help you kind of figure out how to, I mean, especially for the calculator test, that's really what you need is a good graphing calculator. But the College Board really goes over the specifications that they require for calculators used on their test. So whether it's a scientific calculator that you're using, or if it's a graphing calculator, or another type of calculator, you do need to be able to be very familiar with the tools you're using to help you succeed. So if you're not sure how to use something, look at your user manual, ask your math teacher, go through, or like ask another student, how do you solve this? Or make sure that you are familiar with the tools you have so that the tools don't detract from you or prevent you from being able to get the right answer because you just didn't use the right function or you didn't solve it right. Okay. So you need to understand not only the concepts of the math, but you need to understand how to use the tools at your disposal to solve these questions. So one other kind of thing that you do want to note for the math test is that you're constantly using things like process of elimination. You are also kind of constantly using estimation or guesstimation in terms of trying to help yourself figure out or determine as swiftly as possible what a potential answer is. You're also using strategies like plugging in a number or a value for a variable to try to help you determine what the answer should be. All of these things are basic math concepts that you've been using all along to help you really answer math questions. So like skills like rounding numbers, or being able to provide an approximate answer like 3.14 roughly for pi to get you to do your calculations, or using the full value of pi, estimated value of pi, to really help you solve equations for like figuring out circumference of a circle and things like that. And that being said too, they do kind of talk to you here about calculator use, but you're really want to be smart about how you're using it. And you really want to kind of look at the types of questions you have. And if you can solve them without a calculator, it's sometimes more efficient to do so. So it's actually, for your math practice in general, it's better for you not to be using a calculator and relying on a calculator. It's important for you to know how to use one and how to use it, especially when you're dealing with very complex equations or very like computations that would take you much longer to do mentally, or to actually write out step by step, which everyone should be doing anyway. But you really want to be not dependent on your calculator when you are solving things, especially if you intend to go into like a science or type of kind of field. You do need to have very strong mental math type skills, and the best way that you can do that is by using a calculator as little as possible, although it is a great tool to use to help you in graphing calculator, like graphing parabolas or things like that, is going to help you when you're like to think more abstractly about things like the coordinate plane, or knowing which quadrant you're dealing with if you're doing and working with trigonometric functions and things like that. You want to be able to use the tools when you need them, but you want to know how to do it and be confident in doing it without those tools. Okay. That's just kind of a good rule of thumb, especially because there are a lot of questions on the calculator section that you don't actually need a calculator to solve for, okay? You can actually find an answer much more quickly if you don't use a calculator, or if you don't use a more complex version of math to solve a question. So that's why you need to be very cautious and careful when you are evaluating a question and figuring out, okay, what's the best method to solve this? And you always want to do what's easiest for you. And what type of math that is will vary, or what type of strategies you may have learned or techniques in terms of approaching a particular type of problem may vary depending on your training in math, or your teachers, and what they've taught you over the years. But you do want to kind of bear those things in mind. You really have to have good technique and like a strong number sense, in terms of knowing like what an integer is, how to deal with like things like number lines, how to deal with linear equations, and all of those kinds of good things. So that's kind of an important kind of component to think about when you're dealing with the math sections. If we're looking at also like your gridding in answers, you do want to review the kind of recommendations here for addressing the gridding in section of the math tests. So you want to make sure that you're marking no more than one circle in any column. Only answers indicated by filling in the circle will be scored. Okay. So even though they're requiring you to write in your answer, if you don't actually fill in the circle for that answer, you're not going to get credit for it. So they're having you handwrite your answer, and then they're also having you have you fill in like the bubble for that answer. But it's only the bubbled answer that is going to give you points towards your score. And that's because of how it's scored. It's scored by a Scantron machine. So it doesn't really matter which column you begin entering your answers, as long as the responses are recorded within the grid area, you'll receive credit. Okay, so just to kind of, I mean, unless a problem kind of indicates otherwise, really, your answer can end up being a decimal or a fraction, and the grid can only hold 4 decimal places and can only accommodate positive numbers and 0. Okay, so that kind of narrows down where your answer should fall, which is helpful, I think, in general for students. So if you're getting something that's a negative number or that's obviously less than 0, then you did something wrong. So you need to check your answer and check your work. So something like, also, you don't have to leave fractions in lowest terms, which is something different from what most math teachers require. So it's something you do kind of want to keep in mind. And also, if you're dealing with mixed numbers, they need to be converted to improper fractions before being recorded in the grid. So those types of things need to be considered. And if the answer is a repeating decimal, students can grid the most accurate value the grid will accommodate. Okay, so here is kind of an example of like the fraction 7/12. So you can write it as 7 with a division symbol acting as the fraction line, and you have 12. Okay, and then, or you could put it in as a decimal as 2.5. Okay. And then you would grid in as you see it here. So make sure you're doing this on every section like this, on the grid in answers. If you have an answer like 201, it can be in either order. It doesn't matter so long as you are consistent. Okay. Acceptable ways to grid 2/3 would be as a fraction, as a decimal that's repeating, or as an approximated, like rounded decimal. Okay.
to the nearest thousandth. Yeah. Or no, hundredth. I'm sorry. So the nearest hundredth here, whatever fits in the section. Okay. I want to switch gears now, and kind of look at each of these kind of math sections a little bit. So heart of algebra type questions, again, just to review, are really going to focus on things like creating, solving, interpreting linear equations or expressions in one variable. And then you also have, you might be using things like rational coefficients. You might have multi-step processes to solve or simplify. You might be asked to simplify the expression or the equation, or solve for the variable in the equation. So there are a lot of different types of questions you'll see, and how you approach it will vary from question to question. Creating, solving, or interpreting linear inequalities in one variable that represent a context is really one other kind of thing that you'll see. So things that have rational coefficients and an inequality that require many steps to kind of solve or simplify or solve for a variable. You see a lot of these types of questions. You see a lot of actually algebraic questions, more than you see the tougher kind of trigonometric or like trigonometry or analysis, trigon analysis type questions that you would see, or like harder level math. You want to be familiar with geometry. You want to be in terms of understanding how to solve for perimeter or circumference or area for different types of shapes. You need to be able to, or figures, be able to understand what surface area is, to understand what volume is, and how to solve for different figures. You also need to be familiar with properties of particular shapes, be they triangles, circles, or some kind of quadrilateral, or some other type of shape that you're kind of dealing with. So you need to be familiar with those terms because you're going to see them on the test. You also really want to be looking at, I mean, really, we already kind of went through this, so I don't, in a previous class, so I don't really want to belabor this more than not, but we've kind of discussed this. It's just kind of more of a reminder for you that they do break down the types of algebraic type questions you can see on the test, and how to kind of what they're really focused on, or the variations of these types of questions that you might see. So things that you want to know and be familiar with. So yeah, there's that. And then the problem solving and data analysis. I know we've gone through this section too, but there are going to be, like, the problems really are going to be looking at your ability to do quantitative reasoning exercises. And it's especially going to be looking at things like ratios, rates, proportional relationships. And it really requires you understanding and applying unit rate. Okay, so you need to be able to understand data sets. You need to understand how to determine outliers, how to look to finding patterns or spread of data, deviations, like standard deviations, things like that. You need to be able to understand what they are, what they do, all those types of things. You want to be looking at kind of the application of problem solving and data analysis. So just like how we are asked in the writing and language test, and even in the reading test sometimes, to interpret data and analyze it. Here you're doing it on a mathematical level, mostly. I mean, here you're really looking at how to understand and interpret numbers, how to really look at relationships between numbers and different kinds of computations, and really solve complex type of problems or multi-step type of problems. So that could be especially dealing with things like ratios, understanding really what a ratio is, and what real numbers are, how to work with them, kind of understanding single solve and multi-step problems that deal with percentages, things that involve measurement of quantities, units, and unit conversion, which are very much a real world skill, like how to calculate the cost of using a particular type of paint for painting a room, or to measure the total area that you would have to be painting for within a given space, or something like that, like that you are familiar with different kinds of problem solving skills to help you kind of calculate things like density, or to understand what density is when you're working with, like, how to combine science concepts with math, how they kind of relate to each other, how to kind of understand to convert units to or things like dealing with temperature in different scales of temperature, or dealing with like the metric system versus the imperial system, or different things like that in terms of measurement, understanding those types of things, understanding scatter plots using linear, quadratic, exponential models to kind of describe how variables are related. So that's like dealing with the equation of a line or a curve of best fit, interpreting lines in the context of a given situation, or using a line or curve of best fit to make predictions related to data. Those are kind of key areas here too. You want to be looking at things like graphs, being able to interpret and understand information from a graph, be able to look at a set of and determine a value or set of values based on information in a given problem. Understanding properties of graphs and relationships, and how to represent data on a graph, and those types of things, and understanding what exponential growth is, using powers, different things like that, that you are familiar and comfortable and confident with those types of math skills to really help you apply those skills in more complex contexts, not just in isolation. Being able to kind of categorize data and relative frequencies, and kind of figure out conditional probability, or understanding how to kind of deal with variables or independence of events kind of occurring, and how to kind of do those types of predictions or those types of calculations. Inferring information about population parameters based on sample data. So that is going to be very applicable to sciences in certain contexts, especially things like social science or political science, or things like that, where you're dealing with populations as a whole, or understanding kind of information that you're gleaning and how to interpret it, or if you're doing data analysis, things like that are really going to be helpful for you in the long run. Understanding statistics, like on a basic level, they're not expecting you to necessarily have had a statistics class at this point, but it is a type of math that is very relevant to many careers, many different kind of fields of study, and how we use statistics to help us investigate data and analyze shape, center, and spread, to kind of understand the ideas of mean, median, mode, and range, and standard deviation, things like that, that are kind of key ideas related to data, and understanding what is kind of happening with data and how to explain it to other people. Making inferences and evaluating reports, justifying conclusions, determining appropriateness of data collection methods. So this could include understanding things like tables, graphs, or text summaries of like of data, being able to interpret data from a question or from a figure that's being used to describe it, or an infographic or something like that. So there are a lot of different kinds of questions that you can see, but this is really focused on patterns, on using and interpreting data, on analyzing data, and being able to convey it to other people. All right, so then the last kind of main math kind of section before we really tackle or look at some problems and examples in test 7 from the original, in terms of the categorization of math questions from the College Board, is the passport to advanced math. Okay. So these kinds of questions aren't necessarily advanced math questions. This is more prerequisites that you need to know in order to get to before you study more complex, more advanced versions of math, okay, at the college level. So this is kind of your breakdown of the essential skills you need to master in order to pursue a mathematics heavy kind of career or course load in terms of your major. So these are kinds of things that you really need to be looking at, like understanding like structure of expressions and ability to analyze, manipulate, and rewrite these expressions. So you need to master these types of skills. So that means, I mean, it also kind of includes things like reasoning with more complex equations and interpreting and building functions. So being able to know these types of skills so that you can then apply them at higher levels of math once you start pursuing higher levels of math. Okay. Some questions do for this type tend to use a calculator, some don't. Sometimes it's not actually needed or recommended. So a lot of these you're really going to see, I think, on the calculator portion mostly, which means that you don't always need a calculator, or it's not always recommended to solve it with a calculator, but it's possible to solve it with a calculator. And it's permitted for you to use a calculator if you wish. However, it's not always the best choice. So you want to make sure that you're doing what makes sense for you and that will help you solve a question quickly and efficiently. Okay. You want to kind of like these types of questions really focus on understanding quadratic and exponential functions, or kind of dealing with equations that are in a given context, and really kind of looking at things like rational coefficients, solving things with multiple steps, or simplifying or solving an equation. You're also going to be looking for the most suitable form of an expression. So finding the form that fits the problem that you have to solve. Okay, so that means really, it could be for an expression, it could be for an equation, but there may be a particular trait in a given context that you need to focus on to get, like sometimes presenting a formula or like an equation in one form isn't the most appropriate to focus on to answer your question. And by putting it in an equivalent form, you can more accurately provide the information that you need to answer the question. Okay, so being able to manipulate equations and expressions to put them in equivalent forms, and knowing what equivalent forms are and the kind of properties you use that enable us to put them in equivalent forms, and why they're equivalent, will really help you with these particular types of questions. Also, knowing equivalent expressions and that involve things like rational exponents and radicals. So things like simplifying or rewriting from other forms, or things that involve equivalent forms and algebraic expressions. So using structure and kind of the fluency and knowledge of how to use like the order of operations and different things like that to help you solve a problem correctly and quickly. Knowing what quadratic equations are, having rational coefficients, making sure that you are presenting the equation in the best form possible for the given problem. Algebraic, like knowing different forms of algebraic structure and how you can manipulate that structure to solve in order to help you solve a question. Adding, subtracting, multiplying polynomial expressions and simplifying. Those are kind of key things. Solving equations with one variable using radicals or a variable in the denominator of a fraction. That was actually something similar to the question that I was searching for in practice test 8 to show everyone, but it was elusive and I need to find it still. But really you want to be looking at a question. So even if it looks like it's daunting, it may just be the form that they're presenting it to you in. Or they might be trying to show you that even things that look complex can be broken down into a very simplistic math rules, okay, or laws and things like that. So like you just kind of want to think about, not let the equation or the question overwhelm you, and think about, okay, what is being expressed here and what am I asked to solve for? And is there a simple solution for this equation? Because chances are there is a simple way that you can go through it. They're trying to trick you and to make you think that this is to scare you, to make you think that it's a more complex type of question than it actually is. And that you can apply very simplistic rules and things to equations or expressions that might look very, very daunting in terms of especially when you're dealing with like fractions within fractions within fractions or something like that, that you have you're dealing with variables inside it as well, so that you're or dealing with exponents within all of that too, and or other kind of layers and equations and things that are making it more complicated at first glance, when really you're just solving for to figure out what like a basic reciprocal, or you're dealing with something to just figure out what one value, like how to get one variable isolated to figure out what it would be. And you're not actually being given values to solve, like to substitute in for any variables. So you're not actually being asked to solve for it. You're just being asked to figure out, okay, what would be the what would this one variable equal based on all of this information, that type of thing. So other types of things like interpreting parts of nonlinear expressions, rewriting rational expressions, doing like understanding the relationship between zeros and factors of polynomials. So things like that, being able to sketch graphs, to be able to factor polynomials, to be able to kind of understand kind of key principles of these types of skills. So understanding like nonlinear relationships between two variables, dealing with algebraic and graphical representations. So I mean, that can entail a lot, but mostly it's really you're looking at relationships throughout all of this. You're looking at how can I put this in an equivalent form? How can I simplify this? All of these are basic skills that you've been working on since you started learning math. So even if you're being asked to deal with like function notation or interpreting function notation, you're still focusing on like being able to convert and find an equivalent form, or to understand the same kinds of concepts that you've been applying at a basic level to algebra, to geometry kind of concepts and things like that. So you want to kind of think about what the question is always asking you, and using the information in the question to guide you, and any figures that they give you, or any kind of graphs and things, and thinking about, okay, what does this seem like it's asking me, and what is it actually asking me? So I think that the majority of the math questions look scarier than they actually are in most cases. Some of them do require more time to solve for, in which case you should be doing those at the end, so that you have more time to get more questions right by solving easier questions first. And the type of questions, again, that you find easier will vary from student to student. I do kind of want to switch gears now, to look at practice test 7. And we can kind of talk about any questions you had about how to solve certain things, and just kind of do some like just discussion about actual example problems, since we've kind of been going through this content more on an abstract level, and theoretical level than on like an application level. So I want to actually look at some of these types of things and talk to you about how to really kind of approach them. And towards the very end, I do kind of want to recap about what you need to do for your next steps for your exam prep, and what you should be doing and to prepare yourself for test day. I know we talked about it last week, but since this is the last class, I do want to make sure that you understand really what you should be doing in order to do your best on the test. Okay. All right. So just hold on for 1 second. All right. So looking at practice test 7, remember that for the math section, for the no calculator portion, you have 25 minutes and 20 questions. Whereas if you kind of look at the calculator section, and get to that section. Skipped way too ahead, way too far. You have 55 minutes and 38 questions. So they do, at the very minimum, give you more time to work on the harder type of questions, because it requires more time to solve them in most cases. That doesn't mean that that's like that you can't solve them without a calculator, or that you can't solve them quickly. You can, in some cases. Some questions do require more time, in which case they of course should be one of the last questions you do. If you're not familiar still with the kind of introductory information they give you for the math sections, you really need to familiarize yourself with them. So these are formulas that they give you. And the reason they give them, I mean, like, this wasn't always the case on previous SAT tests. Okay. So you're very fortunate to have these references. They didn't allow students previously, like I mean, they have for years now had some kind of reference for students, but in previous, like earlier testing administration for the SAT, they didn't have these kinds of references for you. So you need to know that you are very fortunate to have them in terms of approaching the SAT. But also that because they're here for you, they expect you to really know these concepts inside and out. And that you need to make sure that you're very familiar with how to solve for circumference, how to do area for a circle, or any of these kinds of concepts dealing with triangles, what a Pythagoras' theorem is, and then kind of understanding how to like what degrees of arc are, or radians of arc are, or understanding angles of a triangle, like degrees and angles of a triangle, properties of special right triangles, what type of triangles we have, all of these different kinds of, and the kinds of quadrilaterals we might have, or other types of things that require you understanding basic concepts in math, and be able to use and manipulate this information to help you solve problems more effectively. Chances are, because these things are on here, there is going to be at least one question pertaining to something on here, probably more than one in most cases. And this includes knowing the information that they give you in the notes, and knowing the information they give you at the end here. Okay, so if you do not know these formula, you need to familiarize yourself with them. Okay, familiarize yourself with them, because it's going to help you. And if you get a question wrong because you didn't check the formula sheet, the cheat sheet basically that they're giving you, that is entirely on you, that you didn't get that question right. And it especially when you could have gotten it right if you had only looked at the formula sheet and used the tools at your disposal. So it's like not being able to, like, having all the information and making a simple calculation error in terms of doing your calculations. It's similar to that. And that's the kind of thing that you need to be able to, like, those are easy things to overcome and fix. The harder, more kind of content-based knowledge that you might not have about certain things, that does take more time to develop. And that kind of thing is more understandable if you're still struggling with this particular type of topic. And that just comes with experience and with familiarity and practice, with knowing those different kinds of math concepts. But when they give you information here, or if you skip a step in solving, that's and you end up making a careless error because of it, that is or don't provide your response of how you solved it, so you can't check your work and note that you forgot a variable in one part and it totally messed your answer up. You need to be able to show your work. You need to be able to know how to use these formulae and to be able to help you get ahead and understand the concepts. So please familiarize yourself with them. Okay, so looking at question in section 3 here, we have a variety of kind of expressions here. So most of this is algebra. You do have a question here that's dealing with imaginary numbers and dealing with radicals. So you do need to, and you do need to be able to be familiar with that. You also have a variable expression using fractions and things like that you need to, and coordinate pairs. So you need to be familiar with what that means. In terms of solving it, you deal with powers, you deal with fractions, and functions. So this is a function type question. You have word problems. You have where you have to kind of glean the information within to solve within each question. That's why it's very important for you to annotate the questions and find the key information by circling and underlining keywords and phrases, to help you know and identify what it is specifically you're solving for. Because sometimes they'll have a long passage, like a group paragraph really here about it, and you'll forget in the context of looking for things like, what am I actually solving for? Or the way that they phrase it might be very convoluted or very complex in terms of their sentence structure, and it might throw you off. It might deter you. Like here, for instance, this is like practically 4 lines of a sentence. Okay. And it's something that is really going to be used to try to trick you, ultimately. That's really what is happening here. So you want to be able to identify key information. You want to be able to figure out what is it actually asking you and kind of note that. Um, you can also kind of note, okay, what form should my answer be coming in, based on the information that you also see in the answer choices. So you can let that kind of guide how you're solving it, but you don't want to rely on that necessarily, because you need to be able to figure out, how should I solve this? How do I get one of those right answers? Um, or what answer? So here, again, you're dealing with like things like factoring, or you're dealing with like understanding constants in algebraic expressions, and different things like that. Here you have different variables. You have, in question 9, you're dealing with inequalities, and you're dealing with the variables and understanding what those values might represent or might mean based on this information that's in the passage, or in the passage I'm calling it. It's basically a paragraph here that they're talking about. So also, again, here's kind of one of those scary looking things that involves variables in and complex fractions. But what they're actually asking you to solve for is to find an equivalent expression. So for this particular fraction, so an equivalent way of expressing this fraction. So it's not necessarily as complex as it might look. Okay. So that requires understanding how negative exponents work, how fractions as exponents work, and how having like how fractions generally work in terms of dealing with expressions like this. Okay, so how you might convey this information. Okay, here we're kind of focused on understanding what a parabola is and understanding how functions work, in terms of showing information in the graph, for the x coordinate, and understanding those types of concepts. Here again, we're looking for the value of k. We don't really know what x is going to equal, but we need to figure out what the value of k would be. Okay. Here again, we're dealing with equivalent expressions using fractions. So a lot of that may require understanding what a reciprocal is, things like that. Inequalities, again, and kind of looking at and interpreting things like knowing what different angles represent, like complementary angles and things like that, knowing what that kind of means, how many angles are, like this actually is probably a good example of a question that's going to rely on your knowledge and your whether or not you read through or are familiar enough with the formulae that they give you and the information from the title page, because for this section, because it's going to tell you how many degrees are in a triangle, and how many and how to kind of figure out kind of the relationship between angles and degrees. So these types of things are things that you want to think about too. And also knowing like what the approximate value of pi is to apply it here, where a is a constant. So what would the value of a be? And knowing what radians are. Again, that relates to information on that formula sheet at the very beginning. Here, they're giving you if an algebraic equation. So we have our expression here. We have 2x plus 8 equals 16. What is the value of x plus 4? So that requires figuring out what x equals, right? So you can do that with this equation by solving it. and kind of figuring that out from that information. So, and knowing that whatever you do to one side of an equation, you always have to do to the other, and that type of thing. That's kind of a key thing on this test too. Knowing order of like operations, how to solve these types of things, knowing what constants are meant when you're dealing with expressions and dealing with variables, understanding kind of graphing lines and XY planes, all of that. Kind of looking even on the math test for the calculator portion, there are some slight differences here between what the information that's here and what's on the other formula sheet. Generally speaking, the formula are the same and the information down here are the same, but the information here is different, okay, in the notes section. So you want to make sure you're looking at that, okay? Interpreting like charts and graphs and things like that. The table basically here that we have that is what it's focusing on, interpreting data analysis. So these types of questions and figuring out what the ratio would be in this case, what fraction of the dogs are fed only dry food. So you have to figure that out based on the information at hand. Okay. So really also like looking at conversion of units, 1 meter equaling 100 centimeters, knowing what equivalent, how to put things in equivalent forms, those type of things, dealing with percentages, all things that we just kind of really talked about and reviewed in terms of the concepts that they test you on, being able to solve, like satisfy inequalities and knowing which of these and determining which would be best to solve that. Dealing with data distribution, so standard deviation and things like that, that you're dealing with a scatter plot and being able to identify that this point here where my mouse is focused is an outlier, and noticing that this is a line basically of best fit. So it doesn't fit every single point on that line, but it is definitely the best trajectory for the overall kind of distance from the sun. So this has to do with astronomy and understanding kind of distance and density. So you're dealing with a lot of science concepts, but you're also dealing with distance, like astronomical units here, compared to like grams per centimeter cubed and different things like that in terms of how it's being represented. So understanding kind of what the line of best fit is representing and understanding how to interpret this for questions 7 and 8. So this is just information you need to know about in order to answer questions 7 and 8 for the scatter plot. And it's probably more of like a data analysis type question that you need to focus on. So dealing with solving equations like this as well, in terms of algebraic expressions, being able to figure out the approximate density based on the information at hand here, or figuring out how to do proportions and things with dealing with percents and rates and things like that. What else? So which following system of equations? So dealing with systems of equations, not just singular equations by themselves, and kind of solving for that, understanding the value of X degrees here and understanding how to figure that out based on what type of shape we're dealing with, what type of figure. Here, this is a basic computation for like figuring out sales tax, as well as for figuring out prices of things. So this is a practical skill application that you'll be using all the time when in your life. You're also going to be looking at like different time, dealing with velocity, dealing with distance, So miles per hour. So understanding that that's a concept of velocity, which is velocity equals distance over time. So distance being miles over time, hour here, okay, is speed, which is velocity. Okay, so you're dealing with that kind of concept in physics. You're dealing with time, which is minutes, represented by minutes here. So being able to understand all of those different kinds of units and how they relate to one another and how they relate to that formula of velocity equals distance over time, to help you figure out the answer to the question. If you even actually need that, I don't think you actually need that to solve the question, but knowing that relationship would help you solve for which of the following statements is not true concerning Teresa's run. So figuring out logic based on scientific fact and mathematical fact, okay? Fractions, scatter plots. So being able to interpret data, percentages, again, fractions, being able to solve when you're dealing with variables, what this kind of models for the y-intercept here on the graph, on an xy plane in an equation. So knowing the formula for an equation of a line, different things like that, and what it's representing. Dealing with area. So where we're dealing with surface area in this case, and dealing with square roots and kind of like radical signs, basically. So these are all kinds of things that you need to be familiar with. And it's just kind of more of the same here. Functions. Circles. So all things that you really should be focusing in on, being able to like interpret data, figure out the slope of a line, things like that. Identifying the area of this shaded region, things like that. Dealing with tan with B. So there are not very many questions like this one using this particular type of function in trigonometry, but it is something that does occur like in this practice test occasionally. Typically, if you're going to see something with trigonometric functions, it's sine or cosine. It's not going to necessarily be any of the other ones like tangent. So knowing that that happens rarely and happens to be one of the ones on this test, something you should know. So just kind of to recap about what you should be doing to prepare for the test is to make sure that you're eating well the day before. The days leading up to your test, you want to have kind of low key. You want to conserve your energy. You want to do a little bit of review. You don't want to exhaust yourself by doing a full length practice test because you need to build up and conserve your energy for the actual exam. You also want to be able to make sure you have all of your supplies and things, your ID, practicing with things like a mask if you need to go to a testing center that's requiring you to use one. Because if you don't practice with it, a lot of students get thrown off with it because of the amount of oxygen that you're breathing with when you have a mask on for COVID precautions. So you do want to get in the habit of doing that when you're doing your practice, but also making sure you're having a good breakfast, you're getting to the testing center early so that you can get used to the testing center, have all of your supplies ready to go, and go out the door first thing in the morning, and just making sure that you are mentally preparing yourself to do the best that you can and giving yourself a break before you start the test, because you need the mental holiday, so to speak, to get you through the challenging 3-some hours of testing. Okay, so I thank you all for such a wonderful class. It's been a pleasure working with all of you, and I wish you the best in all of your future endeavors and on, of course, on your SAT class. On your SATs. If you have any questions ever, feel free to reach out to me. I do private tutoring for students, so you're welcome to reach out to Embrace and try to set something up if you want to do further work with SAT or any other subject. Just let me know. I am very, very happy to have gone through the class with all of you, and I wish you the best. So thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful night, and good luck on the SAT. Thanks. Bye.
Okay, so thanks for watching, and please remember to contact us at info@embracetutoring.com to set up any personalized private tutoring sessions you would like. Stay tuned for future videos, and best of luck with your studies. We definitely encourage you to visit our Instagram as well as TikTok pages if you have any questions along the way. Take care, guys. Best of luck with your studies.